Welcome back to our lesson on language. This is part 3 of language. And this topic for this part of the lesson is called language, thought, and culture. And this whole topic can be an entire kind of upper level linguistic anthropology class because there's a big question here. How much of our thought is determined by our language and vice versa? So a long-standing topic in linguistic anthropology has been just how much language shapes our culture and our ability to think. Two main arguments have developed around the topic of language, thought, and culture. One side of the debate has been well framed by Noam Chomsky. That name might sound familiar. Chomsky argues that humans share a similar language ability and thus ways of thinking. So human brains are more alike or all alike, and our language doesn't determine our thought. Our brains do, and since we all have the same brains, it's less likely for language to shape our thought. That would be the Noam Chomsky side of things. So Chomsky argues that language is essentially hardwired into the human brain. It is an innate capability that we all have as human beings. He essentially argues that all human languages are ultimately, despite their surface differences, built on similar principles. As evidence supporting this position, Chomsky cites the wide ability to translate thoughts and sentiments from one language to another. If we can translate anything from one language to another, there must be an underlying similarity between these languages, according to this notion. The other side of this debate has crystallized around the Zapier-Whorf hypothesis, proposed by two guys named Edward Zapier and Benjamin Lee Whorf. This hypothesis holds that different languages create different ways of thinking. They argue that languages effectively serve as a form of classification for the world around us. If different languages make use of different classifications, then they fundamentally change how we understand the world. In support of this hypothesis, Whorf cites his experience working with the Native American language Hopi. English is generally considered to have 3 tenses, the past, present, and future, but Whorf found that Hopi used only 2 tenses, a combined tense used for both the past and the present, and a separate tense for the future. Whorf argued that this fundamentally changes the way the Hopi think, arguing that the Hopi have a different conceptualization of time, because, in their language, the past and present reflect a lived reality, and the future is only hypothetical or a potential reality. So here's the question. Does this mean that their language shaped their thought? Does our language affect our thought and culture, or does our thought and culture affect our language? So that's very interesting. Have you ever kind of conceptualized an idea or recognized something that you didn't know the word for, and then somebody said, oh yeah, that's called this or that, and you said, oh yeah, so that's what it's called, and then you're able to kind of think even more abstractly about that concept because you have a word for it. That could be an example of what we're talking about here. Does thought or language influence thought? I think it's easier for us to think about things, personally, if we have a word for it, right? It's easier to classify things if we have shaped categories with our language. Not to mention the fact that many of us, while we're thinking, have kind of a narration going on in the back of our minds. Could we think the way we think if we didn't have our own language to kind of narrate our reality? So these are kind of the questions that are asked within the topics of language, thought, and culture. And I don't have any firm answers for you. There's probably a little bit of truth to both of these hypotheses. So, here's some examples of what I said. There could be new terms, that you hadn't thought about before. And once you realize that there's a name for it, then you can kind of study it and scrutinize it a bit better. So that's basically what I said in the last slide. Let's move on to sociolinguistics. I think this is always an interesting topic. So now we're kind of talking about within one culture. We're not talking about the differences between languages. We're talking about different people in one society and the different ways that people in the same society can use language, all right? So language seems to have at least some impact on the way we think in our cultures. Our culture clearly impacts our language use, particularly when cultural systems of power overlap with language use. So power and language go hand in hand. So whenever we talk about power, we're kind of talking about politics a little bit, or at least maybe social structure, social hierarchies, class, race, privilege, the elite, the aristocracy. All of these topics can kind of be examined from the lens of sociolinguistics. So sociolinguistics is the study of the ways in which culture shapes language and language shapes culture, particularly the intersection of language with cultural categories and systems of power, such as age, race, ethnicity, sexuality, gender, and class. Your textbook, and I'm not sure if it's the current textbook you're using or the one we used when I was writing this lesson, but the use of the N-word is one example. For example, a sociolinguistic study of the usage of this word will uncover the rules by which it is used, such as by whom and in which context. As we know, some people, it's socially acceptable to use this word in some situations, and in many situations it's not. So there are rules of use. The rules of use and the reactions of others will vary greatly depending on the speaker, the tone, and the audience. A few other examples within sociolinguistics include different linguistic worlds of men and women and code switching in academia. So this is a video. This is probably My Fair Lady. There's a clip. You can access it probably from the PDF version of this lesson. And then these links look at an article and a video on vocal fry. And it was thought that has a lot to do with gender, but not always. So that's another topic within sociolinguistics that deals with the use of vocal fry and different genders. So again, sociolinguistics is when different kind of structures of power or different levels or layers of the same culture intersect with language, and how people within the same culture can use language differently depending on kind of what part of society they're in, their gender, their class, their race, their academic level, and so on and so forth. So it's really interesting. I encourage you to look into it. And this concludes part 3 of the lesson on language. Please proceed to part 4, and thank you for listening.